I once consulted with a man who had inadvertently conditioned himself to be aroused only to images of women tied up. And the way in which this had happened was that at the age at which he was looking for sexy pictures to use for masturbation, he went through his father's possessions, and all he found were copies of an outdoor magazine called Field and Stream and copies of a U.S. form of entertainment known as detective magazines. At that time, the detective magazines typically had on the cover a sexy-looking woman with her skirt hiked up or her blouse opened, who was bound and threatened by a man with a weapon. What happened to this man is that as he masturbated to the sexy aspects of the picture, he found himself arousable only in the presence of bound women. And this became inconvenient to him as he started to date. And so he sought help in changing this pattern of behavior. And it's no coincidence that when we are able to search the possessions of sexually sadistic serial killers, we find that many of them have collections of detective magazines, or at least their covers.
The significance here, of course, is what you see is the fear on the victim, the fear on the face of the victim. The knife here is to her throat. It can be a knife, it can be a gun, it can be a bag placed over her head, a plastic bag, it can be a rope around the neck, but there's always an intimidation on the part, usually of a female, with a male aggressor. The male aggressor's face oftentimes is out of the picture. If his face is in the picture, it's oftentimes concealed, or it is not necessarily visible, maybe from the side view, etc. But the fact is that there's that look of fear. There's a little bit of sexual implication, not nudity, but possibly clothing aside. In this case, you just have some deep cleavage and some prominent breast features. But that look of fear, that knife, and that invisible man. Every time we see that male figure, the offenders that have told me they are the aggressor. And if they saw a clear, defined facial feature, it would ruin their fantasy. A normal person might say, well, a police officer is arresting this young woman. Apparently she's been involved in some crime and he's taking her in. The sexual sadist, the sexual killer would say, this guy got himself a policeman's uniform. He has identified himself as a police officer. He's placing handcuffs on this woman who thinks he's an official law enforcement officer, but truly he's going to take her and sexually assault and rape her and use this as a guise.
One serial killer was a policeman. When arrested, Officer Gerard Schaefer was found to have adapted images from detective magazines and seemingly benign naturist publications to create his own custom-made pornography.
This picture is very interesting because the individual chose to doctor up this young lady here and putting a rope, putting a noose around her neck and tying her ankles. Consider for a second that the look on the face of these two young women are smiling. They're happy. This woman looks something less than happy. Their hands are in front of them. Her hands are behind her. And in this fantasy of this individual, he pictures her to be tied up, hands behind her back, noose around her neck, about to be hung. So again, he's taking a normal picture and converting it to a sadistic, a pornographic picture. Again, one of the pictures taken by the individual himself depict a hanging.
Gerard Schaefer hanged this woman. His violent fantasies of murder had become a reality.
So you see some very strong parallels here between the development of the fantasy and the actual acting out of the crime against another human being, all based on that fantasy of the detective magazine.
Some of the material which Dahmer found most stimulating had a universal rating at the cinema.
He had two kinds of films that were important to him. The first were male homosexual pornography of a very ordinary kind. The second were certain science fiction type films that he had watched repeatedly, namely a scene in The Exorcist 3, a scene in Hellbent Hellraisers 2, and a scene in Return of the Jedi. In each of those films, he had picked a part in which a powerful figure is able to do things to other people to control them. And he would watch that scene over and over before going out to cruise for a victim.
After the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer struggled to control his fantasies of murder for 9 years. He enrolled at the University of Ohio He flunked out after only 1 term. His father, realising his son needed discipline, encouraged Jeffrey to join the army. After 3 years, he was released because of constant alcohol abuse. He moved in with his grandmother in Milwaukee and found work as a mixer in the Ambrosia Chocolate Company. In the struggle to control his fantasies, his behaviour became more abnormal.
He took a mannequin from a department store, thinking that if he had that mannequin with him and sleeping in bed with the mannequin, etc., that maybe he could control the impulses that way. And he also attempted to dig up a body, a deceased person's body, thinking that perhaps that would be a way in which he could control the behavior. But his control ultimately broke down.
Dahmer began to attend gay bathhouses, where he drugged other members in order to have sex with their unconscious bodies. In March 1987, he received a 1-year probationary sentence for exposing himself to minors. 8 months later, Dahmer's deeply rooted drive to murder once more overtook him.
I was drinking at the 219 bar. It's a gay bar downtown on Water Street. And it was closing time. And I saw this white Caucasian guy, probably 5'10" or 5'9", 130 pounds. Looked attractive to me, so I asked him whether he wanted to go back to the hotel with me. I had a room at the Ambassador that night. And he said yes.
He thought nobody would elect to be with him. And the only way he could be with someone, you know, is to capture them, to drug them, and to kill them.
His drink had the sleeping pills in it, about 7 pills. The next morning I woke up and he was lying there on the bed, dead. His chest area had been crushed. So apparently sometime during the night, I had been beating him on the chest with my both fists, because my fists were bruised. I have no memory of doing it. Just remember waking up, laying on top of him, and the complete shock. Couldn't believe it. And so in the afternoon I decided I'd get a suitcase, a large suitcase with wheels on the bottom. Put him in the cab and drove home to Grandma's residence.